Welcome to the GeoHeritage Group webinar on the Western Ghats of India with the World Heritage Tag. It is one of our region which can still claim to have retained its pristine habitat and apparently continue to remain unspoiled by the activity of man. This region therefore can satisfy the criteria announced by the UNESCO for recognition as a geopark. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Madhav Gadgil and Dr. Narendra Prasad, both noted ecologists of the country, who will introduce us to this wonderful region of India. All of you are welcome and participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Namaskar. I am delighted to join this discussion. Internet became widely available. Internet, incidentally, which had been developed as an effort of scientists who were working in the European Atomic Research Network groups and were not working for any industry which was asserting any proprietary rights anyway. So with the internet and free availability of information exchange, the free and open source software quickly gathered pace. As I said, since I had been interested in all these developments from the very beginning, I began to follow what was happening. And I saw that one critical component that became freely available was the wiki software, and it began to be applied in the form of an open, free encyclopedia, web-based encyclopedia Wikipedia, which now has become an incredibly rich source of information available to everybody. Following all this, I was seeing what was happening on the ground. Professor Satish Dhawan, who was simultaneously the director of Indian Institute of Science and the head of Indian Space Research Organization, was a remarkable scientist dedicated to freedom of information and sharing. So when the satellite imageries became available, he started looking at what was the information available on land cover of India. I think it was 1981 or 82 when, through the National Remote Sensing Agency, which was under him, he published the land cover data of India. That data suggested that the forest cover of India was around 15%. The official government agency, Forest Department, were making claims that it was 22%. I also knew that those claims were bogus because I had participated in Planning Commission discussions when these figures came up, and it was clarified that 22% was land under the legal control of Forest Department, which included what UN Deber, one of the influential politicians of the time, called largely treeless forests. And in fact, in this case, around 7% of the 22% claimed were treeless forests. Let me say in conclusion that if it were possible, I would have very much appreciated joining in person in any case. So let us keep this going. Now, if there are any responses to what I have recorded, then please do get back to me with your queries and clarifications or perhaps objections, and I will make another video recording in which I will try to respond. Thank you again for this opportunity, and keep up your efforts.
Good evening to all of you who are present in this wonderful geoheritage series of seminars. Sri Ravi Kumar has invited me to present on Western Ghats biodiversity. I am thankful to him for the invitation extended to me. In this topic, I will very briefly talk about the unique kind of biological diversity that we have. Incidentally, this also happens to be a hotspot of biodiversity. Along with Himalayan biodiversity, this Western Ghats biodiversity is recognized internationally as the two hotspots of biodiversity. As you all know, Western Ghats is a long chain of mountains starting from Gujarat, precisely Dangs in Gujarat, to Kerala, passing through 6 different states of Gujarat, Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. Now it covers about 1600 kilometers north-south direction, and covers, according to one estimate, it covers about 160,000 square kilometers of area. Now, looking at before we look at the biodiversity, the kind of diversity of organisms that we have, we need to essentially talk about the determinants of biodiversity. What are the determinants of diversity? Of course, being a tropical country, we have been blessed with abundant amount of sunshine, and of course, being a monsoon area, we receive quite a bit of rainfall, and that pattern of rainfall is very interesting as far as Western Ghats is concerned. It is in this next slide, slide next to the Western Ghats map, shows the intensity of rainfall from east to the west. The deeper shades of blue indicate the higher amount of rainfall, and lighter ones indicate the lesser amount of rainfall. On the next slide, you see a topographic, because of this rainfall, it produces diversity of vegetation types. You can see in the next satellite image the kind of vegetation that is resultant. It's a The green uh, shaded area is actually the forest areas, and as you can see from north to south, the greenness increases, indicating that there is much more density of forests in the southern parts as compared to the north. We will come back to this little later when we talk very briefly about the vegetation types in the next slide, which is on ecoregions and ecology, basically the ecology of the Western Ghats. So these are very rich forests, home for tropical and subtropical forest types are there in these ecoregions. The northern Western Ghats contains moist deciduous forests. Northwestern Ghats montane rainforests also are there. Southwestern Ghats moist deciduous forests, and Southwestern Ghats montane rainforests. This is in a common parlance where common man can understand, but we do have a very detailed very scientific study on the vegetation types done by the French Institute of Pondicherry way back in 1950s itself. Very detailed maps of the forest types, and till date nobody has done better than that, though the recent attempts at the space Ministry of Remote Sensing and Department of Space try to give the a temporal definition of this forest. But as far as the species composition, plant species composition, the types of vegetation is concerned, that's a classic study that we have on the forest vegetation types. So this vegetation types, I mean, one major gradient is that the Palghat Gap. As you know that the Kerala part where Palghat district begins, there is a gap in the mountain chain. Now, in a sense, the southern Western Ghats, which denotes south of forests, south of Western Ghats, they have fairly abundant amount of moisture and so on, and the dry season is number of rainy days is much higher compared to the northern parts. As a result, the very good evergreen forests like what you see in Silent Valley and so on. And as you go north towards Karnataka and then to further on to Maharashtra, Goa and all, the length of dry period increases, though the rainfall is produced in an intense period, probably the same amount what you see in many parts of Kerala. Since it is concentrated in a very few days, the consequent dry period increases, and therefore you get moist deciduous forests. Now this attribute has an important connotation for animal species. That we will talk in a little while. So this also produces, because of this copious amount of rain, the kind of water bodies, the kind of waterfalls that you have is very scenic, and tourism potential areas are quite substantial. In fact, because of the rain, it receives the copious amount of rain it receives. Western Ghats, in a sense, are actually a kind of a hydrological boon for the rest of peninsular India, because from there the rivers, important rivers, Godavari, Krishna, Kaveri, various other things, they drain out the water into this peninsular India, which forms a basis for the agricultural activity and for various needs of industry and for drinking water and so on and so forth. So in a sense, the Western Ghats are a water tower for peninsular India, though it is a very narrow strip of things because of the monsoonal winds coming and striking and unloading their moisture in the amount of rain it sustains I don't know how much population, but if you compare for the entire peninsular India, it's very substantial amount of population of India, and it produces therefore a wide variety of habitat types which are conducive for various animal species. I will briefly recount that, which is starting from not so charismatic species such as a Malabar gliding frog. Incidentally, the amphibian diversity, the frogs and things, reptiles and so on, of the Western Ghats is amazing. Even now, new species are being discovered. Since they are, not so conspicuous compared to many arboreal mammals and other charismatic species, nevertheless, they have a very unbelievable amount of diversity in amphibians. And recently, these days, people have called out, because of the climate change and things, these can be very good indicators of the impending doom of the climate change and their consequences. It's a very good indicator species. We call in ecology, these are the indicator species of the possible changes that the environment is facing. Now we also have things which are quite attractive, quite charismatic, like Nilgiri langur, which is quite abundant in Kerala and in Tamil Nadu, and in parts of Karnataka, so on. So you can see them quite a lot. And then the important, these are the in ecology we call these as a flagship species, meaning that these in some sense they harbor, they herald the health of the forest and the health of the ecosystem. Line-tailed macaque, it's very abundant in Kerala, followed by Karnataka, and up to, in fact, in Karnataka you get up to Shimoga forest, that is Garisappa and things, and further north they are not there, simply not there. And you also have a lot of endemic bird species, such as this Nilgiri wood pigeon. It's one of the 14 or 16 endemic species. The endemic species means they are confined to very narrow areas. They evolved over that, and then they are acclimatized to that, and they are quite abundant in those areas. Next, we come to see the even more charismatic animals like tiger, elephant. We'll talk in depth some about this tiger and elephant, because the government of India's efforts of conservation is quite substantial for these two species. You may ask, why only these two species? What about other species? The idea is that since tiger is in a food chain wise, it is a predator, so it depends on deer, and in deer in turn depends on vegetation, grasslands and things. So if you take care of the needs of the tiger, then you are taking care of the entire habitat. Similarly, the elephant, apart from its cultural significance and it's almost like Ganesha, we all Indians believe that it's a Ganesha. So the cultural significance it denotes to the fairly large sections of the people that these two are some of the most well researched and then well focused kind of subjects for research and conservation as well. And you see on the right hand side, the mountain goat, the Nilgiri tar, which is there abundant in Kerala, high ranges, Munnar and all those areas, and in Nilgiris in Tamil Nadu, Nilgiri Plateau, Upper Nilgiri Plateau, they're quite abundant. The interesting fact here is that about Nilgiri tar is a relict species. Relict species means some kind of a leftover kind of a thing. That is, in the geological past, when the last ice age was there, when ice spread over quite large areas of the Indian subcontinent, the you have this species distributed in all over, and Himalayas currently we have a cousin of this one, this Nilgiri tar. It's called Himalayan tar. It looks similar to that, a little more bulkier and so on. Hemitragus, both are same genus, Hemitragus, and this in a sense, geology and conservation can, in some sense, I can talk in a mutually compatible language, and you can see the interdependence of the geological phenomena. We also have flagship species like hornbills, for example, the great horned hillbill. It's a wonderful species which is actually it's a forester. It actually helps in growing forests because it eats the fruits and then deposits the seeds, disperses the seeds which germinate profusely. So it's a very good natural agent for propagating forests, and very good kind of species again. And you have this species like barbet, Malabar barbet, Nilgiri pipit, and then white-bellied tree pie, all of which are actually subjects of intense investigations by researchers. And you have a lot of PhD students whose theses are actually on these very bird species. Now, amazing as this diversity of the species, and there are incidentally anyone who is interested, they can actually see this. There are a lot of videos on YouTube on Western Ghats, on beautiful landscapes, species, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of websites like Indian Institute of Science website on Western Ghats. It has got environmental information system on spend years and years looking at watching these forests and watching these wonderful creatures, how nature wonderfully works and so on. You have a lot of conservation issues. It's not anything new. It's been there for quite some time now. Habitat destruction. Habitat meaning the places where all these wonderful vegetation types and all these mix of the wonderful animals, birds, insects, frogs, all these they occur together in a habitat. It's a home. It's a home for a variety of species. So this destruction is happening. It's not anything new. It's been happening for quite some time. But in the recent past, I mean, in the sense for last 200, 300 years, ever since India was colonized by British, the scale of destruction has enormously increased. And they thought the British, being Europeans and so on, who were quite new to the tropical environment, they found that the forests were accepting for few species like teak and rosewood and things, a handful of species. All the things are miscellaneous, what they call miscellaneous species, and which has no value. So therefore, they need to be felled and planted with things like teak. So you have, as consequently, you have large tracts in Western Ghats which are the good forests were clear felled and then planted with teak. Oftentimes not with good results. So the soil is denuded, the underlying rock is exposed, and being very high rainfall area, once the forest canopy is removed, the intensity of the rain actually it sort of erodes the soil, and the underlying rocks are, the soil is washed away, and then it's very difficult for plants to survive. So you have large tracts, especially the lateritic things being exposed, and lateritic because of the minerals the elements like iron and manganese and things. Once they are exposed to the elements, they harden and then they no longer can harbor. So you have a large outcrops of lateritic rocks all over Western Ghats, especially facing the western side. So in Karnataka, especially, you can see here Gokarna, for example, Ankola, and all these regions. You have large tracts of these things, and South Canara as well. And you have people mining these lateritic crops for their activities. I mean, for house building, etc., etc. Now that's how the habitat destruction happens. And you have also developmental projects like irrigation projects, hydroelectric projects, and so on, quite a lot. And then, of course, the ubiquitous mining, is the third dimension in destruction, while the other ones are habitat destruction and development projects are perhaps two-dimensional, at least superficially. The mining is really, doing a lot of damage, both illegal and legal mining, and habitat fragmentation. When a lot of lip service is given by various agencies saying, no, we are conserving. See, look, we are planting so many trees, so many thousands of hectares of things. We are greening and things like that. They may be doing so by destroying already they just destroyed forest, virgin forests, evergreen forests, and so on. You can plant with green cover, but then the quality of the thing is quite different from the original vegetation and so on. So these fragments, though it looks green from satellite map or even your casual observer can see the greenness all over, but because the original components of the vegetation is destroyed, you have fragments. Even sometimes when you open up the canopy for railway projects, for example, it's a linear or developmental projects like roads and all that. They open up the canopy, electric lines, for example, posing. So they in the opened up areas you get different species which are not exactly conducive for some of the native species. So that's how the fragmentation occurs, and this fragmentation really ruins the animals, the home ranges, their territory, and things like that. Now, this habitat fragmentation is one which is one of the most serious kind of issue, conservation issues that we face with these two species that I was talking in the first few slides on conservation of tiger and elephant. The tigers at the time of 1970s, they dwindled so alarmingly low, less than 3,000 animals entire Indian peninsula. That government of India woke up and then took up Project Tiger. It's a mission mode kind of a project which has done quite a bit of wonder in restoring the numbers to quite a large numbers now. That's a very successful conservation things. Of course, of late you have a lot of issues with that also. And then second one is the elephant conservation, which the common thing for these two projects is recognizing the corridors, what we call the corridors for conservation, because although we have a lot of national parks, sanctuaries, and all that, they are few hundred square kilometers cannot conserve a big species. A predator like a tiger or an animal which requires a lot of forage and movement like elephant. They need large tracts. So when you have this fragmentation, you obviously need to connect these good natural forest with a not so good one by a corridor. So this is where we identify the conservationists identify the corridors, and that process is there ongoing. And this is where the conflict comes in the human animal conflict, because a lot of these areas also are inhabited by people, and they cultivate crops, and the animals, they raid the crops, and people shoot them down or poison them or whatever. So all these kind of conflict situations, they are quite serious, and every year the forest department spends quite a bit of money in compensating the people, and this issue is something which has to be done not in an ad hoc basis by giving money and then placating them and things, but long-term solutions are needed, and people have shown that how it can be worked out in many areas. And you will see in this cartoon, it's a kind of a animal-centric cartoon. Is a green cartoon taken from internet. The species here saying, the kind of issues that they are facing. Any person can actually see with humor what the animals feel like. If only they have voice, probably this is what they would probably be expressing. And coming to the solutions part of it and the way forward is we all know that awareness, educational activities are quite needed kind of a thing, because unless common people are alerted to the value of these forests, because these are the forests which we have borrowed from our children. They were bequeathed to us by our forefathers, and then we have the responsibility and the moral duty to pass on to the generations who come after us. So that's where our responsibility lies in, and that towards that we need a whole number of activities. Whole lot of activities are needed. So that in that awareness education is an important thing. There's an outreach activity, and that should be done. And secondly, the stakeholders, various stakeholders. There are a lot of inhabitants, the forest dwellers. Then you have villages. And then you have people who have livelihoods they derive from this. All these are the various stakeholders are there, and these stakeholders have to be taken on board. Unless they are taken on board, like human-animal conflicts, habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation, which was discussed in the previous slide, cannot be done effectively. You cannot be doing a policing approach. You cannot be doing that policing for each and every tree. It's simply not possible. So therefore, you must rope in, and you must take them as partners, not as subordinates or something like what they have done in the past in the British time, that we know what is good for you, so you do it. That no longer it holds, and therefore they need to be done. And there are a lot of examples of that, how you can do it. A lot of NGOs who are working in Western Ghats have shown that with tribals, they have initiated wonderful programs and integrated them into conservation. The Soliga tribes, for example, Kadukurubas and Soligas and all that, these are good examples. And in many institutions, a whole lot of institutions in this Western Ghats region. Tropical Botanical Garden, now it has been renamed into something different. It has done wonderful work in discovering the potential drugs that can be obtained from some of these less known species, medicinal species in the forests and so on. And that potential is, we have hardly scratched the surface, and we need to deploy for our own welfare, even for our selfish needs. If we want to meet, then we need to preserve these forests and conserve these ones, and then be in liaison with the native people, like these tribals and so on I talked about. That we must actually be in partnership. We should be actually doing things. And for government is generally towards they have overarching approach of GDPs increasing, and forest sector should be contributing this much, and then infrastructure building is extremely vital, and all these kind of things they talk about it. And what is missing is a balanced approach. The what if scenarios. What if I don't do this? What if I reduce the scale of this development project? Those kind of scenarios are not conceived, because The engineers and all that simply do not have an education and kind of some kind of love for nature and the value of the nature actually. Now this in this respect, the environmental economics, which is a recognized field of genuine field of study and benefit to the humanity, have actually quantified the benefits that the forests accrue to the humans. We all know that how much of oxygen it produces, how much of nutrients it recycles, and so on and so forth. So that kind of economics, if you look into that, then automatically it comes to that. So that it's not, GDP is not just the physical kind of exploitation of the nature. It's a natural resources like mines and minerals and things, and timber and so on. But actually, the replacement cost, if you take into account the amount of resources that you would need to put so that you can get back the same amount of resources, is mind-bogglingly high. And unfortunately, that kind of economics has never been thought of that. And we have just begun to do that. And that has to be drilled into our, all these pro-development guys. Saying that you must exploit, you must mine more, you must export more, you must construct more roads, more rails. So these are the kind of issues that one should be looking at it more seriously at all levels, not just a few bureaucrats sitting on that and so-called scientists who are sitting and advising people and so on. So these are along with promoting sustainable livelihoods, and then the effective conflict resolution with human face is what is needed. And Professor Gadgil is quite eminently suited to describe in this companion talks of this in this series. And he effectively says that ecology is for people, of the people, and by the people. So this is the way it should be, way forward. Thank you for listening, patient listening.
Our ecologist member of our group, Dr. Narendra Prasad, is going to.
I'm reading, sir. HR Arvind from India, that is how exactly laterite mining is damaging the biodiversity, and how even the beach sand is damaging the biodiversity.
Okay. There are two questions within that question. So the lateritic mining, as I said, it's in the western parts of the Western Ghats where you have the bereft of the vegetation. Those alumina, the iron oxides and things, they get hardened, and then of course nothing can grow on that. And for house bricks, all that, quite a lot of this thing is happening in South Kenya. For example, if you go into the interior parts of it, you can see it actually happening. Especially for those leaf manure forests, Sopinbet in Uttar Kannada and all that. So these are really hardened. Once the canopy is removed, the soil gets exposed to the elements, and then it gets hardened, and so that's how the biodiversity gets affected. And the second part for the beach, mining and so on, for hotels and so on, it's very bad. It's in the east coast, it's not in the west coast though. And it's very well known that removing the sand in large quantities affects erosion quite a lot, and there is a large number of studies already on that. Especially the Chennai-based Institute on coastal and marine environment have extensively documented how the mining of sand affects the coastal areas. And we have seen any number of examples on that. I mean, it's fairly common knowledge, and we don't have to really go about it. Biodiversity-wise, the coastal biodiversity gets very drastically affected by this. Erosion is a direct cause, and then also ingress of the water. In Kerala, for example, it's very well known that currently we have a lot of ingress of seawater into the river waters, and a lot of underground water gets polluted and things. So that obviously it affects the biodiversity. Though it's well documented how it exactly affects what it is. It's there. In terms of direct habitat loss, yes, I mean it is there. But, indirectly also because of this intrusion of rainwater into the freshwater, it also affects biota and things. Okay. Next one.
Next one is Dr. S.K. Vadavan, ex-DG GSI. He had 3 queries, sir. I will read first one. His first one is, what kind of outreach activities to conserve biodiversity? Please, can you suggest some concrete ways? That was his first query, sir.
Okay. Let me answer that. Uh, Well, actually, the outreach activities, the government has initiated quite a lot of these activities. We have environment-related events. There are quite a lot already happening there. World Environment Day, then of course Wildlife Week and Biodiversity Day. All these things are there, but necessary but not sufficient, in my view. So it has to be grassroots level kind of a thing, and a lot of NGOs have actually done it, and not just in the recent past. The earliest example that one can see is of in Himalayas is K. Prasad Bhatt and Sundaral Bahuguna, where they launched the Chipko movement. We all know that if you just recall our memories, we can in 1980s, 90s, this was the movement from the people was quite a lot, and it was all the movement has generated is generated by itself. I mean, from the people's side, because they are the ones who are getting affected and so on. At all levels, it can be done. Concretely, urban from urban perspective, you see that urban biodiversity we can to begin with in major metropolises. Already, some activities are there in terms of the tree mapping, urban tree mapping, and then bird watching and things. Bird watching is a very extensive activity that people have taken up. These are and of course the crucial thing is that younger generation in the schools with the curriculum that we have in CBSE or ICSE or whatever state syllabus, really like textbook-related kind of stuff. It actually needed activity where to take them into the forest or any other environmental situation, and we can do wonderful things. And there is in fact a Center for Environmental Education, which is an Ahmedabad-based institute, which is doing wonderful work. And then there are other institutions, and then in Hyderabad, in Kottayur, there was children for nature education and so on. So these activities need to be developed and needs to be formally integrated into the syllabus. See, because they are not into the formal syllabus, teachers will always say that the students are overburdened and these are all something they do not get any marks and things like that. Definitely, this situation has to be reversed. This is where the planners and the managers of all the human resources, they need to come together and do that. And this is where we can probably make an impact. So it becomes like I mean, just to say that for example, SACON, where I was employed as a scientist, I knew how this activity has outreach activity has impacted. For example, the children were brought into the thing. They were not just given a simple lecture on how to do organic farming and things, but actually they were asked to grow crops with like proper control, where you don't do the organic farming, but you do chemical fertilizers, and then you do the second set of the experiment where you put in your organic input, and they would test the result on their own family members. Would ask their parents, now tell us which is the one or which is like better, without divulging what is the crop and so on. Invariably, they say that this is the organically produced one tastes much better and things. This is how the children themselves educate their own, family members and fathers and whatever. This is how, I mean, this is just one example of that. There are any number of examples. Bangalore schools, they are doing wonderful work. So these are the concrete ways, and this needs to be studied in a very formal way. To me, this goes a long way in strengthening the environment. I hope I answered your question. Thank you. Next one.
Sir, next one is again from Dr. S.K. Vadavan, ex-DGSI. His question is, can you identify some geo-trails for raising awareness and promoting geotourism, showcasing some rare geo-heritage sites and selected biodiversity in the area?
Again, unfortunately, there has been not much cross changes between the geologist community and the biologist. But we know there are spectacular things. For example, in Uttarakhand, in Karnataka, we have the Yan limestone group. They are very spectacular. They are also culturally very, very important. We have that in Dehradun also. So that kind of thing, geotrack, people are up. There are groups which are the trekking specialists who actually take kids and all that to these locations and all. So it's already happening in many parts. Again, as I said in the answer to my previous question, that since there is a lack of proper accounting in the syllabus of the school children, they do come, but they enjoy the thing and all that. But since it doesn't get credited to their academic activity, they come and just go away and things. If it gets credited to their academic achievements, I'm sure they will take much more seriously these things as well as the students. There are any number of such stretches in Western Ghats. We need, first of all, close dialogue with the geoheritage group or geologists. For example, in Karnataka, it's a very famous area, also rich, very, very rich from a minerals perspective. Kudremukh, many areas which are actually people are using it as a geotracks and so on. In fact, there are private enterprising people, enterprise people actually have captured these potential areas for geotracks. There is more, of course, there is a bias towards biology, ecology, and so on, but not so much about the geoheritage part of it. That's where some good and hard input from the geoheritage geologists is needed. Thank you.
One question from Mr. Sabashaj Som from GSI. His question is almost similar to this one. Is there any site in this long track where biodiversity and geoheritage together can be showcased to the tourists?
In all, for example, Maharashtra, I mean the Misas, they should understand this term anyway. They are very wonderful kind of a thing, the structures, and we all see that layered kind of a thing in the vegetation developing on that. For us, we can see the biologists, ecologists, we see the importance of that. A geologist, if he's a companion kind of a thing or a literature kind of a thing, which saying that how the methods formed and so on, then the biologists, ecologists would chip in and say how important it is for various organisms and things. That kind of integration is the need of the hour. I hope the geoheritage group recognizes this and then it takes it. You take it any stretch of Western Ghats, they are all wonderful places where you can do that. More spectacular things is what I given examples in Maharashtra to Karnataka. But I'm sure Tamil Nadu also there is. Yes, in fact, we know that in Tamil Nadu there are quite a lot, and in Kerala as well, where we have the primitive tribes, Kanis and so on. They are still, they don't have any settlements like we have, and they deep in the forest. Nilambur, for example, they deep inside. If you go, they're all there inside, and they're not, you will be surprised actually to see that people can exist in a state like Kerala. So it's a wonderful kind of a thing to go and actually explore these. As I said, a proper documentation is really needed, and then also some kind of concerted and coordinated kind of approach is really the need of the hour. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Another question, I think this is an interesting one from Mr. Amrish Chatterjee from Jaipur. Is Mussoorie Hills type reclamation possible in the Western Ghats?
Yes, I mean, we have many number of examples. Tamil Nadu, there is in a group, there is a research group in scientists called organization called Nature Conservation Foundation, NCF in Mysore. And for last 20 years, they have shown what can be done in terms of reclaiming the lost kind of diversity. And my talk had shown a primate species called lion-tailed macaque. If you can go back to that, you can see that the lion-tailed macaque habitat they have actually done in the evergreen, very good evergreen forest. They have actually restored, the principles and practices. They have actually shown how it can be redone, and there are any number of examples, not just this example, but many places. But unfortunately, these are all very small kind of case studies. In a large scale kind of a thing, you need to put in through various stakeholders, including the government, forest department, and things. Unfortunately, the kind of a thing that restoration that is happening is that what they call forest department calls is gap planting. Wherever there are gaps are there, then you plant with them. And the choice of the species is very, very critical on that. And the way it should be done is very, very special, and a lot of focus and attention has to be given. And that's where researchers and the managers of the forest need to get together. So this goes across all kinds of landscapes where they have done mining in Western Ghats, Goa, then Kerala, and so on. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. These two activities, reclamation and restoring, and then these mining activities do not go hand in hand, which is a very crucial kind of, very critical kind of activity that is needed.
Thank you, sir. There is one comment rather, not a query. One Mr. Vijay Prakash, he says this is very interesting the presentation. His another suggestion was geoscientists should come forward to showcase some geosites suitable for geotourism. That was his comment rather, Mr. Vijay Prakash.
Yes, I agree with that, because we have a large number of national parks and sanctuaries in the Western Ghats belt. We have a large number of national parks and sanctuaries. Within that, those parks, there are a lot of geologically interesting formations and interesting sites. As I said in my the first talk, first question to Madhwan Saab's question on the sites, I told that these are the areas that we need to discover. They are known to us, and we sort of say that these are geologically important and all that. But in a more in-depth, more interesting way, more fascinating way, that in a story form, to capture the imagination of the various stakeholders. That's what is needed, and I agree completely with that. But to begin with, these maybe about 40-50 protected areas, at least we can say sample of them. All of them is not possible to take together, but you take sample of the most spectacular one, and actually do this joint development of this strategies and action plans. Thank you.
The nomination as World Heritage Sites of Western Ghats and Sundarland is based on category 9 and 10. But the justification given for category 9 in both cases include major geological processes which are related to category 8. This is the what you call glaring omission with far-reaching consequences in geoheritage conservation. What's your opinion? That was his question, I think.
Yeah, good question.
Explanation, please. That's what Professor Rajshekhar Reddy's question, sir. Hope you got the question, sir.
I got the question. It's a good question. What I was trying to say is that I'm not going to. Not necessary. I understood it. is that this differentiation into articles, World Heritage denomination, I have not gone into any depth. But certainly it needs to be done, and but I do not directly see any kind of threat for designation of heritage sites because of the that article. I am not aware of that. I do not know the finer nuances of that. But, still, I do not see that even if the World Heritage site, it doesn't matter if the state government or union government decides that it is a site which is unique for the geoheritage perspective, from a geoheritage perspective. Certainly, nobody can prevent us from doing that. We may not immediately aspire to be in a World Heritage site as equivalent to what we have already achieved for some of these areas in Western Ghats from an ecological point of view. But really that anomaly can be overcome, I'm sure. But to begin with, the action should start from from grassroots levels at the state level and at our central government level. And once this is done, I think they can rectify this anomaly. Yeah, I'm sure. That's about it I have to say. Thank you.
Sir, there is just one query from Dr. S.K. Vadavan. He just wanted to thank you for your presentation, and his comment is very interesting presentation. Integrated approach is required. Is needed. That's what his comment, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This is
By S.K. Vadavan, ex-DG GSI.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, if there are no more comments, Dr. Narendra Prasad, on behalf of all of us who have listened to your webinar with great interest, we thank you for this excellent presentation, and we also remain thankful to Padma Bhushan Madhav Gadgil for having accepted and given his part. Though it is very limited, still it is very, very effective. We thank you very much, Dr. Narendra Prasad. So if there are no more questions, we will close this webinar. Thank you one and all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.